Hello and welcome to another myPath Melanoma case study video. I'm Loren Clarke, dermatopathologist and medical director for dermatology at Myriad Genetics. And the purpose of these case study videos is simply to share and discuss some cases that I found interesting at the clinical, histopathologic, or molecular level, and address some of the frequently asked questions regarding the myPath Melanoma test. And today's case is a lesion from the right shoulder of a 60-year-old male. And the specimen is the central portion of a skin excision that has a maximum dimension of about 17 millimeters and contains this centrally located zone of fibrosis measuring about 7 millimeters in maximum dimension. Within the fibrotic area is a melanocytic proliferation that's distributed largely as single cells within the epidermis, some of which are present within the spinous and granular cell layers of the epidermis, along with variably sized nests that are arranged along the dermoepidermal junction and within the superficial portions of the underlying dermis. Now, this case was used in one of our clinical validation studies, so I've had the chance to study and discuss it with many other dermatopathologists at multi-headed microscopes. And most recognize that there are multinucleate cells along the base of the fibrotic area, and that together with the relatively geometric appearance of the fibrotic region indicates that this is most likely the site of a prior biopsy procedure, and the fibrosis is attributable to that rather than tumor regression, repetitive trauma or friction, or a desmoplastic or sclerosing neoplasm. And the spindle-shaped or elongated cells within the dermis did not express S100 by immunohistochemistry, confirming that they are fibroblasts and not melanocytes. But clearly the most striking feature here is the extensive pagetoid spread of melanocytes, many of which vary somewhat in terms of their nuclear size, shape, and chromatin characteristics. But one other thing to note is that these lesional cells are relatively similar throughout the specimen, suggesting that this is a single population of melanocytes. In other words, there's no evidence of a second population with features that might suggest the remnants of an ordinary nevus. In this setting, it's often important to assess the distribution of the atypia. Is it confined to the zone of scar fibrosis, or does it extend beyond it? The image on the left is from the left upper periphery of the scar, and the image on the right shows the right upper periphery. Now, I'll roughly outline the peripheral edge of the scar in both images so that it's a bit more obvious. And that highlights the fact that the entire lesion seems to be localized to the area of fibrosis, at least at first glance. And I say at first glance because at higher magnification, the epidermis peripheral to both the right and left sides of the scar does contain at least a few conspicuous melanocytes, which are also arguably increased in number as well. But whether these melanocytes should be interpreted as an extension of the neoplasm beyond the scar, or whether they simply represent so-called reactive melanocytic hyperplasia, has been a matter of some uncertainty and debate among the many dermatopathologists who have now examined this case. In any event, the pagetoid growth that was so striking in the center of the lesion is clearly not present beyond the scar. It's entirely confined to that area overlying the fibrosis. Now, most of us were taught that oftentimes the most effective first step in evaluating any previously biopsied melanocytic neoplasm is simply to obtain and examine the initial biopsy. In many cases, that's all that's needed. But in this case, for reasons that still aren't entirely clear, neither the prior biopsy nor the report was made available to the referring institution. That's an unusual situation, fortunately, but it's something that can occur from time to time in my experience, and it forces us to rely on other means of establishing diagnosis. But with the admittedly limited information in hand, at this point, what would be the most likely diagnosis for this case? A, superficial spreading melanoma with desmoplastic component. B, superficial spreading melanoma with extensive regression. C, recurrent or persistent nevus. D, locally recurrent melanoma. Or E, uncertain. Well, armed with only the information that I've shared so far, each of these was a diagnostic consideration that was initially put forth by one or more experienced dermatopathologists. But most eventually eliminate the first two possibilities and end up favoring either a recurrent nevus, a recurrent melanoma, or simply concluding that the diagnosis is entirely uncertain and probably shouldn't be attempted without at least some additional information. And in fact, in one of our studies, this case was examined independently by 7 very experienced dermatopathologists, all of whom acknowledged a good deal of uncertainty here. But 2 of them somewhat favored a diagnosis of recurrent nevus. One somewhat favored a diagnosis of recurrent or sclerosing melanoma, and the remainder concluded that the diagnosis simply couldn't be made or shouldn't be made with any certainty based on only the information that was at hand. And all of the participants suggested that at least some form of additional information or ancillary testing was needed in this case. The myPath Melanoma result for this case indicated that it was malignant melanoma with a score of positive 1.5. And the referring pathologist classified the lesion as a locally recurrent melanoma, and a sentinel lymph node biopsy was performed and was negative. But 4 months after that, melanoma developed within multiple axillary lymph nodes. 6 months after that, disseminated melanoma was detected within the small bowel, and the patient unfortunately succumbed to metastatic melanoma about 2 years after this specimen was obtained. And since the scar itself extended no deeper than about 1 millimeter, this appears to have been a relatively thin melanoma that unfortunately underwent metastasis and progressed to disseminated disease. So the lack of access to the prior biopsy is really what makes this a case where ancillary testing was particularly helpful, if not absolutely necessary. But cases with definitive clinical outcomes in general are also a valuable opportunity to consider some of the clinical and histopathologic clues that might at least have suggested correct interpretation. In general, there are a few key pieces of information to consider when evaluating recurrent melanocytic neoplasm, probably the most important of which is the histopathology of the prior biopsy. Most of us were probably taught that review of the initial biopsy is often all that's needed to make a definitive diagnosis in a recurrent lesion, and that has been my experience, and that alone might have solved the dilemma here if it had been available. The bottom line is that whenever possible, every effort should be made to examine that initial biopsy in a case like this. Beyond that, age of the patient is often very helpful information. In a young patient, even when the histopathologic findings suggest melanoma at first glance, traumatized or recurrent/persistent nevus almost always warrants at least some consideration. But in this case, while the patient's age alone probably shouldn't completely eliminate all consideration of recurrent nevus, it should significantly raise suspicion for melanoma. Knowing the time to recurrence is sometimes very helpful, assuming it can be determined accurately, because in general, nevi tend to recur relatively soon after the initial biopsy, often within a matter of months, whereas local recurrence of melanoma tends to occur later, often several years after the initial biopsy. If present, an obvious nevus remnant beneath or adjacent to a scar is something that may favor recurrent nevus, particularly when the other data supports that interpretation as well, although it obviously doesn't exclude the possibility of a traumatized or sclerosing variant of melanoma arising in association with a nevus. Atypia that's entirely confined to the area overlying the scar is often cited as a feature that favors recurrent persistent nevus, while atypia extending beyond the scar can be a strong clue to melanoma when it's present and when it's readily apparent. In this case, there were some conspicuous melanocytes present beyond the scar, but as I mentioned earlier, the significance of those cells generated some debate or uncertainty even among some very experienced dermatopathologists. Some thought they were probably lesional cells, but others interpreted them as evidence of reactive melanocytic hyperplasia. And finally, the degree or extent of pagetoid spread is often said to be a very helpful clue to melanoma, and that has been my experience. Limited upward scatter or pagetoid scatter of melanocytes within a nevus as a consequence of trauma or irritation is well known for its potential to cause confusion for melanoma. and I have seen fairly extensive pagetoid scatter in some traumatized nevi, but at least in my opinion, the degree of pagetoid spread seen in this case would be very unusual for a traumatized nevus. That alone might not convince me that this was melanoma, but extensive pagetoid spread should usually raise the level of suspicion significantly, regardless of the presence of a scar or other evidence of trauma or irritation, particularly in a patient who's 60 years old. I'll conclude by addressing a question that's sometimes asked about the myPath Melanoma test, which is whether it's useful for differentiating recurrent nevus from melanoma. And as this case suggests, it can be very useful in this situation, as long as the specimen submitted for testing is representative of the lesion. Just like histopathologic interpretation by a dermatopathologist, ancillary tests can only analyze what's actually contained in the sample submitted. Ancillary testing of re-excision specimens and previously biopsied lesions is generally discouraged because in some cases, the initial biopsy has removed the most representative portion of the lesion. So the specimen submitted for any ancillary diagnostic test should always be the one that contains the most suspicious or most histopathologically concerning portion of the lesion. Usually that's the initial biopsy, not the re-excision. Re-excision specimens too often contain only the peripheral portions of a lesion, and in some cases what little residual tumor remains can fall below the threshold that's necessary for accurate test results. More concerning is that in the setting of melanoma arising within a nevus, the melanoma can, in some cases anyway, be mostly or entirely removed by the initial biopsy, leaving only the nevus component within the re-excision. Now, obviously, this is a situation that could produce a benign test result that would potentially be very misleading. So in short, the initial biopsy is generally the preferred specimen for testing. On occasion, though, the re-excision specimen is the more representative specimen. Usually this happens when the initial biopsy has sampled only a small portion of a much larger lesion, or if the re-excision contains an area concerning for malignancy that wasn't present within the initial biopsy. So, for example, on rare occasions, re-excisions of lesions that are diagnosed as dysplastic nevi will contain an area that's more suspicious than any present within the initial biopsy, raising concern for something such as melanoma in situ arising at the periphery of a dysplastic nevus. In any event, lesions such as recurrent persistent nevi, traumatized nevi, locally recurrent melanomas, sclerosing variants of nevi and melanoma were all well represented within the myPath Melanoma validation cohorts. Hundreds of examples of these types of lesions have been among the 35,000 or so cases that have been tested in the clinical setting. So the bottom line is that to the extent that the lesion is well represented within the specimen that's submitted for testing, there's no evidence that accuracy of the myPath test suffers in this setting. Well, I hope you found this video interesting and useful. Thanks as always for watching. And as always, please get in touch with questions, comments, or suggestions of topics for future videos at lclarke@myriad.com.